So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan, and this is another episode of Backroads Arizona. In this video, I'm going to be adjusting the ride height on my 2019 Turbo S Velocity RZR. The reason for this is we've added an aftermarket roll cage, extra spare tire rack. I've also put a storage box on the top of my roof. This all adds extra weight, which has sagged the suspension. So we're going to put it back to what the factory settings are as far as ride height goes. And hopefully this will help me from bottoming out as much as I was out at the dunes. So I'm not saying this is going to fix everybody's bottoming out problem. It might not even fix mine, but I figured I'd give it a shot before putting some money into new springs or shocks. I'm also going to go over the adjustment knob and what I've noticed because I've been playing with mine quite a bit before adjusting this ride height. We're going to go over that as well. So let's get to it. So the information I found to check your ride height is you want to measure at the back of the RZR at the skid plate, and that is supposed to be about 16 inches. So my skid plate is a little thicker because I put an aftermarket one on there. However, I figured I was about 13 inches. So that means I'm about 3 inches low. So in order to adjust the ride height, you're going to want to unload the suspension using a jack, or in my case, I was able to use a hoist to lift the tires off the ground. So ride height is supposed to be measured with the factory tires and wheels that were on it. However, my paddle tires are the exact same height as those tires and wheels. So then I measured from the bottom of the blue part of the shock to the top of the adjustment nut to get a base of how much I need to move the nut. So right now we're at 1 1/8, and we need to go almost 3 inches, and this is 1:1. So we're going to take this almost down to 4 inches. You're going to want to make sure your threads are as clean as possible and use a penetrating lubricant before starting to adjust the nut. If necessary, it might be worth taking a soft bristled wire brush to the threads as well, depending on how dirty they are. So this tool did come in my RZR toolkit. However, I wanted to see what else I could use in case you didn't have it for some reason and needed to make an adjustment. So on the back suspension, I was able to use a 5/16 punch to adjust the nut. So for every inch of travel you move the nut, you raise the car an inch. So it is a 1:1 ratio in the back. And I continuously had to spray PB on the threads to keep the nut turning freely. Gloves are a bonus because this does take a while and it is rough on the hands. Once I got to 4 inches, I stopped and then did the other side as well. Once I got finished adjusting both sides to the 4 inches, I went ahead and let the RZR down. You'll notice the suspension is sitting pretty high. That is because you need to settle the suspension by driving it back and forth a couple times and getting on the brakes pretty aggressively. So one other key to this is if you normally ride with 4 people, you're going to want to have those people in the RZR when you check your ride height, because obviously the more weight that is in the vehicle, the lower the ride height is going to sit. So I've actually got my wife, my 2 daughters, and one of my daughter's friends in the car during this process. So after my wife went back and forth about 3 times, getting on the brakes pretty hard, I went ahead and rechecked my ride height. So I actually ended up closer to 17 inches, but I am going to try it like that and see what it's like. Now let's do the front. To measure your front ride height, from what I saw, you want to measure it on your lower control arm on the rear mount where it bolts up to the frame, center. And that measure should be 15.5 inches. So we're only sitting at about 13 3/4. So once again, we're going to unload the suspension by lifting it up. The only difference between adjusting the front compared to the back is instead of a 1:1 ratio, it is a 1:2 ratio. Meaning for every 1 inch you adjust the threads, it is going to raise the car 2 inches. So when I actually started adjusting this one, it was at about 1.5 inches. I already had made some adjustment to it before taking the picture. So I was a little limited on space on the front, so I wasn't able to use that punch. So I ended up using a 5/16 bolt. A grade 8 bolt would be better because after time I did end up bending the grade 5 bolt. And then I put this rubber over the bolt because doing a 1/4 turn at a time was really wearing on my hands. So this helped out with that. Another option, if your razor toolkit did not come with the adjustment tool, is you could cut an old screwdriver that you don't use anymore down and use that as well. Just try and get one that fits in the adjustment nut as tight as possible. Once again, using penetrating lubricant quite often, I started adjusting that nut and went to about 2.5 inches on both sides. So I actually went through this process quite a few times on the front because I did not trust the 2-to-1 ratio of measuring, but it actually ended up being pretty accurate. So right here, we're just going back and forth and settling the suspension again, and then double checking my ride height, which ended up being right on the money at 15.5 inches. So once getting both ride heights where I wanted them, I went ahead and cleaned off the penetrating lubricant with some brake clean. So before I messed with the ride height adjustment, I did mess with this little knob on the shock quite a bit. And what that knob does is it opens and restricts basically an orifice to allow more or less fluid that's in the shock to go to the reservoir. So the bigger the opening, which would be softer setting, the more oil it's going to flow, which is going to give you a softer suspension. And therefore, the smaller orifice, or the harder you have the setting adjusted, the less oil it's going to let flow to the reservoir, and therefore the harder suspension, and you are less likely to bottom out. So the first time I went to the dunes, I realized I needed to put my suspension setting all the way to hard because I was bottoming out constantly. So there's detents on this knob, so you can count your detents to make sure you're the same on each side. I don't know if you can hear it, but... So as I said, when I'm running at the dunes, I have it all the way on the hard setting, so I do not bottom out, because that is not nice to my body or the car. When we're trail riding in the woods, a lot of times I'll change it and put it on a much softer setting, so the ride is much smoother. One tip on making this adjustment, you want to try and figure out before you start riding what you're going to need, because when that suspension's working hard, those reservoirs get very hot, and you will need some gloves to make the adjustment if you've been riding hard. So I'm hoping this really helps out as far as bottoming out at the dunes, because if you figure I gained about 3 inches of ride height, that's 3 inches more travel that the shock is going to have before bottoming out. I do plan on going to the dunes a couple more times this season, and I will be doing an update video to let you know how it goes. Hope you guys got some good information off of this video and it helped you out. If so, hit like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.